Hey guys, in this video we're taking a look at U-He Satin plugin, which is a tape emulation. So you can use it as a tape effect, you can use it as a delay or a flanger, and there's tons of different knobs under the hood that you can tweak. All right, so at a high level, the plugin is divided into 3 vertical sections here. At the top, you have your main input-output VU meter. In the middle here, you have a section where you can pick the different modes I was talking about. So studio, delay, and flanger. And then you have this contextual menu that'll open depending on that. And then at the bottom, you have this service drawer, which you can open. And this gives you access to sort of under the hood nitty-gritty details of fine-tuning, like the tape head and all the different imperfections that you normally don't want with a real tape machine. The most obvious thing is the input gain knob here, which just drives the input circuit into the tape. And then obviously the output is the output volume. And if you want those to be kind of in sync, you can turn on the makeup gain up here. So if you switch this on, the output will go down when the input goes up and vice versa. So if I just crank up the input, let's play the clean sound. So I can crank this. You can hear it's already kind of distorted with that nice. Up here, you can choose between vintage and modern. If you set it to vintage, it'll kind of start distorting a bit earlier. Then in the middle here, we have the VU meter showing you the left and right channels because this is a stereo plugin. And you can choose whether the meter shows you the input or the output with the switch here. Over here, you can switch RMS on. So if you want a more smooth average volume to give you a better sense for the perceived volume rather than the kind of actual volume. And then down here, you can adjust the reference for what 0 means. And then finally here, you can turn on soft clipping. So there's this kind of built-in limiter circuit. So let's start off with Studio. Studio, you would use this effectively almost like you're running it through a tape recorder. So over here we have the speed IPS, which is inches per second, which just determines how fast the tape is kind of rolling around the reel. So you can set it fast here up to 30 IPS and all the way down to 1.87. If you set it really fast, you start getting more of kind of a lo-fi sound. Versus if you slow it down, you get a kind of a smoother sound. Below that, we have this pre-emphasis knob, which controls the sort of gap of the repro head, which affects the high frequencies. And it's dependent on the speed as well. Again, very subtle. So moving on to the middle here, we have this concept of groups. So what's cool about this plugin is that it simulates as if you had real tape channels on kind of a real machine and the effects of what would happen if you start layering things over the same tape and how those things would kind of blend together. So you can do that by assigning your tracks to different groups. So for example, on this track, I can select group 1. Then I can double click to name it, and then maybe I can name this Whirly, for example. And then if you load a different instance of Satin in a different channel and you pick the same group, those will kind of get combined together, giving you more of like a glue effect. And then up here you have the switch where you can bypass the tape, but still have it go through some of the noise reduction circuits here. And then speaking of that, if we go to the end here, we have this Compander mix, which is kind of a like noise reduction circuit, which has a bunch of different types of encoders and decoders. So let me just demo some of them. So this is with nothing set. And if I pick a tape, a bit more lo-fi. You can set the mix. All right, so let's move on to the other modes. So next we have delay. So this is going to be a much more obvious effect because effectively we're turning this tape machine into a tape delay. All right, so let me first describe how magnetic tape delay works in general. So the way it works is that you would have a long strand of magnetic tape that just loops around in itself and just keeps going and over and over. And then you have what are called heads, or little kind of electromagnetic coils that can either write or read from the tape. So what would happen is that you would have a write head, let's say somewhere in this position. And then when you place something, that gets written onto the tape as it's rolling. And then to listen back to it, you would place another head somewhere else that would listen and kind of read the information encoded in the magnets. And the way you get a delay effect is that you would spread the read and write head apart from each other so that the time where it's written and the time where it's read is different. So it's a little different than your standard kind of digital delay, where instead of thinking in terms of like milliseconds of your delay time, you're thinking more in terms of how far apart the heads are on the tape and how fast the tape is rolling around. So those two things affect both the quality and the kind of timing of your different delays. And what's cool about tape is that you can place multiple different heads, so you can have multiple different repeats, and each repeat you can pan left and right and set different parameters. You have a choice between 2 heads and 4 heads, which you can switch with this knob here. And the controls are the same, and they just kind of change the UI a little bit to fit everything together. So let's take a look at the 2-head approach. Again, this is 1 head here and then 1 head here, but the controls are the same. So I'm just going to go over one of them. So the first thing you'll notice is the slider at the top marked distance, and this sets the distance between the read and write heads. So as I mentioned, this distance affects the perceived delay. So if we just jump quickly to the right here, I'm going to lower the mix down, because for a proper delay effect, you want to blend both the original sound and the delayed sound. So we can hear the delay now with a single delay head. So now we can move this down. And of course now we're getting only 1 repeat because the feedback is all the way down. So on the right here, I can bring up the feedback. So we get a little more bounces. And then of course I can change the overall IPS, which is the speed of the tape rolling around, which will affect the global kind of timing of everything and the quality. And you can set tempo sync here with this button, which will turn these sliders into kind of time divisions of the global clock you have. Then down here we have routing, which sets how the feedback loop is kind of sent back into itself. So by default, you get the left and right channels kind of being fed back into the left and right channels. So sort of 2 independent tracks going. Cross will make it so that the left will go into the right and the right will go into the left when they feed back. And then ping pong, you can choose the mix to be sent into mono and then sent either all the way left or right. So these are just kind of creative ways of sending the feedback back into itself and getting interesting effects. But moving back here to the main controls of the head here. So below the main slider, which is the timing, you have the overall level. So if I put this down, we're not going to hear anything. There's no delay now. So this controls effectively kind of a mini mixer, so that when you have 4 heads especially, you can kind of blend them in with the level knobs. Balance, again, is just a pan, so you can set the delay all the way to the right or all the way to the left, or some mix in between. And then you have a built-in sine wave LFO that is automatically assigned to the distance of the heads. And you can control that LFO by setting its rate here and the amount of modulation. And it'll be visually displayed here with some LEDs. So if I increase the amount, you can see the representation of how the distance will be changed. So if I reduce the rate, so you can set a really low rate and high amount for kind of this slow warble. And of course, I've only been using 1 head now because the level here is down, but I can bring this one up and set a completely different delay time. And maybe I can pan them left and right and give different kind of modulation to this one. So now you can quickly see how we can get these interesting kind of blended effects. And of course we can switch over to 4 heads, and now I can kind of blend in two other heads, similar kind of controls. I can set all kinds of different values, balance these left and right, change mod rates. You can see how this can get really complex really fast. You can crank the feedback. And the feedback has a switch here with a built-in limiter, so you can prevent it from going way too crazy into outer space. So if I turn that off, the feedback can get dangerously loud. So turning on the limiter kind of helps here. And then you have this built-in filter that is assigned to the feedback loop itself, so you can make the delay repeats be a little more muffled or more high-pitched if you want. Or not high-pitched, but high frequencies. So let's switch over to Flange. And Flange, again, is another kind of tape effect. So typically how this was done in the sort of original analog days is that you would have the same recording, the identical recording on two different tapes running at the same time. And then you would have a person just slide their finger. I don't know exactly how it was done, but there's something called a flange that allows you to sort of press down on the tape to slow it down. So then as one is running, the other one is running at the same time, but being slowed down and sped up a little bit, creating a bit of a phase offset between the two. And then you would sort of blend that in certain ways. So the way they've done that in U-He is that they've kind of automated the process so that there's this built-in ramp up happening where as the tapes get closer to each other, the volume is brought up. And then as they spread further apart, the volume is brought down so you don't hear that too much of that phasing. So again, we have similar controls. We have the overall speed of the tape that's running. And then what's different is that here you have the sort of flange effect, and this is how you would basically put your finger on the tape and kind of offset it. So by default, you don't really hear an effect until you kind of move the slider by hand. And you can hear that kind of phasey, flangey effect. And what they've included here is this little trigger button. So when you press this trigger, it'll automatically kind of send a pulse of like a flange effect going of this slider. So let me see if I press that here. You can see that little slider going up and down. You can set how quickly it fades in and out, either in time divisions or in milliseconds. So I can sort of exaggerate that and fade out this way. And then you can multiply that value with this slider. And then you can change the kind of curve, response curve of how the volume gets blended in and out from logarithmic to linear to exponential. And then if you send MIDI to this plugin, which I did in Ableton by creating a separate track and routing it to this plugin, every time you hit a MIDI note, it'll trigger it automatically. So this is a more of a useful effect I find, because then every time you play a note, you get that automatic flanging going. You don't have to change that knob. And then on the far right, the range determines the maximum delay between the two different tapes. So again, you could just experiment with that. And then you can invert the phase, because when the two tapes are perfectly aligned, you can imagine that when you sum up two identical signals, they'll double up in volume. So you can invert the phase here to get the opposite effect, where one of the tapes gets inverted so that when they're added, they cancel out instead. So we can experiment with that. So you get more of a thin effect, almost like a tremolo. we can play around with the service knob here, which you can open up. And again, this just gives you a lot of fine detail about the imperfections of tape, all the stuff that you normally don't want in a pure recording. You can bring that up as an effect. The first thing we can look at is hiss, which will add a bit of that hissy noise that you normally have in like old cassettes and tapes. And then you can set auto mute, which will kind of bring the volume down when there's no input going in. You have asperity, which again is more of like a metallic non-harmonic distortion. Very subtle, but adds that kind of gritty lo-fi. Then you have crosstalk, which is kind of a bleed of the signals between two different tracks on a tape. Then you have wow and flutter, which is sort of slight variations in speed of the tape as it's going around, which creates this like lo-fi warbly, like Boards of Canada type of effect. Then you have bias, which will kind of flatten out the response curve. Let me reduce the noise a bit. Then here you have some controls for the repro head itself. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you can sort of visually and with your ears see and hear the effect. Very subtle. The general effect of all of these is adding kind of a lo-fi-ness to your sound. And then finally here, you can change the different kind of EQ circuits for recording and the reproduction. And yeah, there's different standards here you can play around with. And then you can adjust the overall headroom. Obviously, giving more headroom gives you a nice cleaner sound and lets the tape breathe and gives it room to kind of blend things together. Versus if you bring it down, you'll get much quicker compression and distortion and you'll lose some of the quality. But if you're after a lo-fi sound, you can definitely experiment. So if I exaggerate these just for fun, I can increase the hiss, crosstalk, just make this the like world's most broken tape ever. Decrease the headroom. Now we'll get this like really. It's still a beautiful sound in its own right, and definitely kind of trendy these days with that whole lo-fi hip-hop movement. So now let's experiment with other stuff. We can go back to my delay here. We can create this super lo-fi. And you can of course automate these effects. So if I turn on automation here in Ableton Live, I can select, for example, this slider here, take my pencil and kind of drag it around. Select this one here, drag a different shape. Select this one here, a different shape. So now as my playhead is going, you can see that the knobs here are being automated by the arrangement view here. So now if I play something, you get this really strange. So now we can go browse through some different presets. I'm not gonna have time to go through all of them, but I'll show you the rough categories that are included. So you have things like tape saturation, tape delay, chorus, flanger, and then you have applications, which is kind of a useful shortcut. So if you have like a drum bus, a bass, if you want to run your guitar through it, a keyboard. So right now I have a keyboard, so let's browse through some of these. All right, so I've loaded up a little drum grooves just so I can hear it running with drums. So this is what the raw drums sound like. Plugin is bypassed. Turn it on. You can crank the input. So I'm gonna go over to the presets and we're gonna go to the applications. I'm gonna pick drums and I'm just gonna click on some of these while the loop is running. So yeah, super versatile plugin, very high quality stuff. I can definitely recommend it. Thanks for watching and I'll catch you guys in the next one.